Good day. For today, I'm going to discuss the part 2 of immune diseases. And we are going to cover the following topics. So the scope of the lecture would deal with autoimmune disorders except lupus. We're going to talk about graft rejection. We're going to talk about immunodeficiency syndrome. And the last will be amyloidosis. So, autoimmune diseases are basically from the term itself, you're looking at self-reactive antibodies. It is basically immune reaction against self-antigens. The root word is self. Bear that in mind so that we're talking about autoimmunity. Now, autoantibodies can be assayed. It can be sampled and the titer of which can be determined in the serum of our patients so that when we diagnose autoimmune diseases, we can have the sample of the patient and determine its presence as well as its titer. Now, when we are going to talk about immune diseases, it is important also for you to understand the concept of immunologic tolerance. From the word itself, tolerance, it means unresponsiveness to an antigen. It is supposed to be, again, unresponsiveness to an antigen induced by exposure of lymphocytes to that antigen. So, if you are unresponsive, you are not supposed to mount an immune response, particularly to yourself. So we have this concept of what we call as self-tolerance, meaning you are supposed to lack responsiveness to your own antigen. Because if you do so, then you form autoantibodies, and that is now the backbone of what we call as autoimmune diseases or autoimmunity. Immunologic tolerance is classified into two groups. You have what you call as the central tolerance and peripheral tolerance. When you say central tolerance, so this is what I am trying to discuss now, your immature, self-reactive T and B cells that recognize self-antigens during their maturation in the central, let's say primary or generative lymphoid organs, like for example, the thymus for T cells and the bone marrow for the B cells, are killed or rendered harmless. So as I have said, we're talking of tolerance, so meaning you're supposed to be unresponsive so that in central tolerance, these possibilities of self-reactive T and B lymphocytes are killed or rendered harmless. How is this happening? It may be in the process of what we call as deletion or via what we call as T-regulatory mechanism. When the mechanisms of central tolerance, therefore, would eliminate potentially dangerous lymphocytes to produce what we call as autoantibodies. When the immature T cells are expressing TCRs specific for self-antigen, these antigens in the thymus, signals are produced. The signals are supposed to produce what we call as, or to lead to what we call as apoptosis. When apoptosis happen, this is termed as negative selection or what we call as clonal deletion. In addition, when developing B cells strongly recognize self-antigens in the bone marrow, the cells will reactivate a machinery called antigen receptor rearrangements. And this process is what we call as receptor editing. With receptor editing, it is estimated that the B cells may have undergone this during their maturation. If receptor editing does not occur, the self-reactive cells would undergo apoptosis. Thus, you may have potentially dangerous lymphocytes that may lead to antibody formation. So again, by central tolerance, it means that immature self-reactive, take note of the word self-reactive, T and B lymphocytes, T and B lymphocytes that recognize self-antigens during their maturation in the central or lymphoid organs, like for example, the thymus for the T cells and the bone marrow for the B cells, they are killed or rendered harmless. So again, that's the concept of tolerance. Again, immunologic tolerance, for purposes of emphasis, means phenomenon of unresponsiveness to an antigen induced by exposure of lymphocytes to that antigen, and we are talking of self-tolerance, meaning lack of responsiveness to your own antigen. The other form is what we call as peripheral tolerance. So there are several mechanisms which silence potentially autoreactive T and B cells in the peripheral tissues. One of the mechanisms is what we call as anergy. Lymphocytes that recognize self-antigens may be rendered functionally unresponsive. And that is basically the definition when we say, or the phenomenon is anergy. In addition, anergy can also affect the mature B cells in the peripheral tissues. If the B cells encounter self-antigen in the peripheral tissues, especially in the absence of specific T helper cells, the B cells are unable to respond to subsequent antigenic stimulation and may be excluded from the lymphoid follicles, resulting in death. Or basically, again, death would mean self-tolerance. Another would be suppression by regulatory T cells. You have learned this in the previous chapter, and a population of T cells are called this is a population of T cells called regulatory T cells, which functions to prevent immune reaction against self-antigen. Again, this group is supposed to function to prevent immune reaction against self-antigen. These regulatory T cells develop mainly in the thymus as a result of recognition of self-antigen, but they may also be present in other peripheral lymphoid tissues. The best defined regulatory T cells are CD4 cells, which express a high level of CD25. These are some of the things that you should remember: CD25, alpha chain of interleukin 2 receptor, transcription factor, and FAXP3. These are examples falling under suppression by regulatory T cells. Then we also have what you call as deletion by apoptosis. T cells that recognize self-antigen, T cells, which recognize self-antigen, may receive signals that promote death by apoptosis. So that, again, that the phenomenon we're trying to explain now is deletion by apoptosis. Depletion of T cells occurs not only in the thymus, but also, as I have mentioned, in other peripheral lymphoid organs. There are mechanisms of deletion of mature T cells. It is postulated that if T cells recognize self-antigen, they may express a pro-apoptotic member of the BCL family. That's one pathway, and this is what we call as BEAM. There is also a second mechanism, which is what we call as the FAS or fast ligand system. Upon recognition of self-antigen, the lymphocytes will express the death receptor FAS or FAS, which is CD95. It is a member of the tumor necrosis factor receptor family. So, using this particular PowerPoint slide, what are the points to remember? Again, immunologic tolerance meaning is or phenomenon of unresponsiveness to an antigen. Self-tolerance means you lack responsiveness to your own antigen. And it is the reason why you are not supposed to destroy your own cells. There are of two types, again, central and peripheral tolerance. So, if it gets to be uncontrolled, so what happens then? So, autoimmunity is basically now the problem. Autoimmunity results from a combination of you are having what you call as susceptibility genes, which may now lead to breakdown of your self-tolerance. Again, by self-tolerance, I keep on repeating, it means you are not supposed to destroy your own tissues. You're not supposed to produce antibodies that will destroy your own cells. And so, if you have these susceptibility genes, it may contribute to breakdown of your self-tolerance, coupled with environmental triggers, like for example, in the presence of infection or tissue damage, the release of cytokines, it may promote the activation of self-reactive lymphocytes. And when we have these self-reactive lymphocytes, you are then expected to produce antibodies against your own cells, thereby leading to autoimmunity. Now, why is this happening? One is that, as I have said, you have now defective tolerance or regulation. In the book, it is stated that it might be something to do with inherited or Mendelian autoimmune disorders. So it is something that you are inheriting, or a pattern of inheritance is Mendelian. Or you have abnormalities which may include increased expression and persistence of self-antigens. Persistence of self-antigens that are supposedly cleared. A while ago, I was talking about deletion, apoptosis. So they are supposed to be cleared, or structural changes in this antigen, which results from modifications arising from cellular injury. So that you then lead to the development of neoantigens. Neoantigens are regarded as epitopes that are not expressed normally. So, if they are not expressed normally, your body will recognize them as foreign and therefore will act against it. So, that's entity number 2. The third one is the innate immune response is supposedly giving you activation of lymphocytes and generation of immune responses. The microbes or invading organism or cell injury may elicit local inflammatory reaction, which eventually can trigger subsequent autoimmunity. So take note, again, these are the different mechanisms which may lead to autoimmunity. Now, when we say susceptibility genes, susceptibility genes are, as I have mentioned in the previous slide, are usually coupled with environmental factors like that of infection. Now, if we're talking of susceptibility genes, one group of particular interest would be your human leukocyte antigen, HLA. HLA is regarded to be one of or exhibiting greatest contribution to autoimmunity. One of the most typified or classic example is ankylosing spondylitis and its association with HLA-B27. So again, it is association with HLA. One classic example that I can give you here would be ankylosing spondylitis that is associated with HLA-B27. It is said that if you have HLA B27, you have 100 to 200-fold greater chance of developing ankylosing spondylitis. Now, or it can also be non-major histocompatibility complex genes. There is a table in your book, that's table 6.8, that is enumerating the non-HLA genes. And there's also a table 6.7, which is then enumerating a lot of examples, inclusive of what I have mentioned, ankylosing spondylitis, for those HLA-associated problems. So, under non-MHC, there are three described association, genetic association. One is polymorphism in a gene called PTPN22. Secondly is polymorphism for NOD2, which is associated with Crohn's disease. By the way, PTPN22 is associated with diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and other autoimmune disease. On the other hand, NOD2 is associated with Crohn's disease. And the third would be polymorphism in interleukin-2 receptor, CD25, which is associated with multiple sclerosis. So those are the classic examples of susceptibility genes. It may be HLA or non-MHC genes. As I have previously stated, you have a table in your book. So this belongs to group 1, those associated with HLA, and this belongs to group 2, the non-HLA genes that I was trying to explain a while ago. So there goes your NOD2. Again, as I have mentioned, NOD2 are associated with Crohn's disease, which is a form of inflammatory bowel disease. Now, what is the role of infection? If you will go back or recall what I was trying to discuss, so you have the susceptibility genes and the environmental factors. So infection would fall under environmental function. Autoimmune reaction may be triggered by infection, and there are two mechanisms that are postulated. So the first one is what I am showing you right now. It is upregulation of the expression of co-stimulators on antigen-presenting cells. if these cells presenting self-antigen, it will result in breakdown of energy. A while ago, I was talking of energy. So with energy, if it's that mentioned, what should follow is that you will recall that it will lead to apoptosis. But here, we're talking of autoimmunity. So there's breakdown of energy. So what happens is you'll have activation of your T cells, which will then be directed against your own antigen, hence autoimmunity. This co-expression of co-stimulatory molecules, particularly affecting your APCs, is what we call as molecular mimicry. Molecular mimicry, immune responses against the microbial antigens may result, as I have mentioned, in activation of self-reactive lymphocytes. Molecular mimicry is the classic example given in your book is that of rheumatic heart disease, which is caused by streptococcal proteins cross-reacting with your myocardial proteins, leading to myocarditis. There are other infectious microbes, like, for example, other viruses, EBV and HIV, which also uses this pathogenesis. So, as I was telling you a while ago, by molecular mimicry, we are trying to focus ourselves on that is your invading microorganism. So say, as I have said a while ago, this is your streptococcal infection, your streptococcal protein, which will cross-react with your myocardial protein, and it will cause myocarditis. So eventually, it led to activation of your T cells so that you produce antibodies against your heart muscle, the manifestation of which is myocarditis. Infection may also protect against some autoimmune disease. Although the role of infection in triggering autoimmunity is what I have mentioned in the previous slide, it is also possible that infection may protect against certain immune disease. Like, for example, we have here type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, it is said that there is evidence that in some animal models, infection greatly reduced the incidence of disease. They said that the underlying mechanism is unclear and that the possibility is that infection will promote low level of interleukin-2, which is essential for maintaining your Treg or your regulatory T cells. So remember, this is something to do with self-tolerance. So that explains the first bullet. Diabetes, type 1, infection has something to do with low level of interleukin-2 production. So now, if autoimmune diseases tends to be a chronic process. It tends to be that your patient will be feeling okay and then eventually will go into relapses and then remission. However, the damage is characteristically progressive. The one stated in your book that is the reason for chronicity is that there are intrinsic amplification loops which allows antigen-specific lymphocytes to eradicate complex infection. However, it is also allowing that when the response is inappropriately directed against self-tissue, that same mechanism can exacerbate and prolong the injury. The term is actually referred to as epitope spreading. By epitope spreading, it is in which the immune response against one self-antigen causes tissue damage. It releases other antigens and results in activation of lymphocytes that recognize the new epitopes. So, this is one feature of autoimmune disease. Again, chronic, do not forget, epitome spreading. So the clinical and pathologic response to immune disease is actually determined by the nature of the underlying immune response. It is said to be that most chronic inflammatory diseases is due to abnormal and excessive T helper 1 and T helper 17 responses. Particularly, they said that this is evident in diseases like psoriasis and multiple sclerosis. In some diseases, it is the T cell immunity, like for example, with antibody formation, like for example, in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So, some points to remember before we go into the specific disease. When you say tolerance, you must remember the word unresponsiveness. And I hope you will also remember that there are of two types, central and peripheral. When I say central, you're talking about immature lymphocytes that recognize self-antigen in the central lymphoid organs. I have mentioned the term apoptosis, which basically connotes cell death. In B cell, the self-reactive lymphocytes switch to new antigen receptors that are not self-reactive. So that is supposed to be the concept of central tolerance. For peripheral tolerance, mature lymphocytes recognizes self-antigens in the peripheral tissues. Anergy, apoptosis are the ones that I have also mentioned under peripheral tolerance. If you lose tolerance, then it leads to autoimmunity, and I have also discussed that a while ago. Remember, it tends to be with inheritance of susceptibility genes plus environmental. Under environmental, you have microbiologic agents as a typical example. HLA, non-HLA related. Okay, so we're done with recall of the first few slides. Let us go now to the first topic of or the disease that we are expected to tackle, and that will be your Sjogren syndrome. When you are looking at the patient with Sjogren's, I have placed in caps lock, or I have placed in bold letters what you have to look for. One, check the eyes, check the mouth. So with that, you are supposed to, when you examine your patient, you are supposed to appreciate dryness. Dryness of the eyes and the mouth are the characteristic features of Sjogren's syndrome. It is said to be immune mediated, and it has something to do, the dryness is because of immune mediated destruction of your salivary glands. So first, check the mouth. One, and then secondly, check the eyes. If they are dry, then try to check the salivary glands, where particularly in the neck of your patient. But before I move to that slide, bear in mind that Sjogren's has two forms. You have isolated and the secondary form. So, why am I saying that you have to check as well the neck of your patient? So let me move my slide forward. So, as I was saying, let's do the physical examination first. So you check the eyes, you check the mouth, they're both dry. Next thing you do is you should see the neck of your patient because classically there will be enlargement of the salivary glands. As I have mentioned, this disease is caused by immune-mediated reaction in which your salivary glands are expected to be enlarged because you will have extensive lymphoplasmacytic infiltration with epithelial hyperplasia. So, that being said, as I have emphasized, check for the glands. You are expecting intense lymphoplasmacytic infiltration accompanied by epithelial hyperplasia. It may be an isolated disorder, and that is what you call as the primary form. Or if it is associated with other autoimmune disorder, then that is what you call as the secondary. Among the secondary form, the most common is rheumatoid arthritis, but it can also be seen in patients with SLE, polymyositis, scleroderma. So, how do you diagnose the disease? So, as I have said, check the eyes, check the mouth, check the neck, and you would usually experience or see that the patient will have dryness on the mucosa of the mouth and the eyes because of the immune destruction of your salivary glands. And usually you would see it as a palpable mass in the neck region of your patient. Now, the ANA, so this is autoantibody, meaning you are trying to detect now what is causing the problem in the salivary glands. So you can request for test to determine the presence of autoantibodies. The infiltrate in the salivary gland is predominantly lymphocytes and macrophages. When we're talking of lymphocytes, they are particularly of CD4 helper 2 cells and B cells. That's why I was using the term lymphoplasmacytic. I have mentioned a while ago that for secondary, the most common is rheumatoid arthritis. So it might also be wise to do rheumatoid factor determination. Since we're talking of autoimmune basis of the disease, you have to look for autoantibodies. And one of the most common available in the market would be your ANAs or anti-nuclear antibodies. It may also be antibodies against your RNPs or particularly SSA and SSB. RNPs refers to ribonucleoprotein antigens. It is detected in 90% of patients. So these antibodies are considered as the serologic marker of the disease because it is detected, as I have mentioned, in 90% of cases. So it is also that it can be HLA related. So in here, I have already enumerated the common HLA association with Sjogren's. So as I was telling you a while ago, the infiltrate in the salivary gland is predominantly composed of your CD4 T cells alongside with some B cells. There are patients with possible association with human T lymphotropic virus, human immunodeficiency virus, hepatitis C. But it is also stated in your book that the link between these two viruses and the autoimmune disorder remains to be obscure. So, points to remember. As I have said, the lacrimal and the salivary glands are the major targets of the disease. In so doing, what you will see will be lymphoplasmacytic infiltration of your salivary gland. You may have lymphoid follicles with germinal center. You may have ductal epithelial, lining epithelial cells which may exhibit hyperplasia and eventually leads to obstruction of the ducts. You may see a palpable mass like that of this patient. And do not forget, check the eyes, check the mouth. The keratoconjunctivitis is supposed to be accompanied by complaint of your patient of blurring of vision, burning or itching, and even thick secretions that may eventually lead you to believe that this might be conjunctivitis, or basically accumulating in the conjunctival sac. The dryness of the mouth and the dryness of the ears are the two features that are easy to see. But take note that eventually the dryness of the mouth may eventually give you manifestation or complaint of your patient having difficulty of swallowing food. They also have decreased ability to taste. They may have cracks and fissures in the mouth and dryness also of the buccal mucosa. So with this, take note, it may be primary problem or it may also be secondary. If it is secondary, it is almost associated with other autoimmune diseases, the most common of which, as I have said, would be your RA or rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, so these are some of the things that I have already enumerated a while ago. So eyes, again, the eyes, the mouth, the renal involvement, and of course, do not forget, the secondary form most common is RA. Now, the Mikulicz syndrome is a term in which you have a combination of lacrimal and salivary gland inflammation. The diagnosis here is basically we have to do a lip biopsy, and then again you are supposed to see, as I have mentioned, lymphoplasmacytic infiltration. Now, the lymph nodes are expected to be hyperplastic. It is also stated that it may eventually lead to the development of lymphoma. The type of lymphoma commonly implicated is a marginal zone lymphoma. This is particularly of the B cell type. It is commonly arising because of or on a background of chronic lymphocytic inflammation. And as I have said with Sjogren's, it is more of the lymphoplasmacytic type. Now, there are also certain other autoimmune disorders like Hashimoto's, which also may lead to marginal zone lymphoma. Okay, so that sums up the first disease, which is Sjogren's. Let us go now to the next one, which is systemic sclerosis, or otherwise known as scleroderma. The C there should remind you of the word collagen, because it should remind you of what is very prominent in this patient, which is fibrosis. So in these patients, you will see usually a triad of problems. One is autoimmunity, two is vascular damage, and three, as I have said, is fibrosis. But among the three, I am telling you, the easy way to remember it is this C should remind you of collagen, which equates to fibrosis. There are categories. Categories are either it is diffuse or it is limited. From the term itself, the disease can be throughout the body. The skin is usually the most commonly affected, but it can also affect other organs, like, for example, the GI, the kidney, the heart, the lungs, the muscles. Now, if we say diffuse, we are expecting that your patient will have widespread skin involvement at the onset and rapid progression to visceral involvement. As I have said, GIT, kidney, heart, lungs are common involvement. When you say limited, this is confined to your finger, forearm, and face. So 3F ang code natin dito. Fingers, forearms, and face. The visceral involvement may occur late. It is also notably documented that some patients with limited scleroderma may develop what you call as CREST, which stands for C for calcinosis, R for Raynaud's phenomenon, E for esophageal dysmotility, S for sclerodactyly, and T for telangiectasia. Okay, so what causes scleroderma? So two types. Again, it may be limited, it may be diffuse. Do not forget, three things: autoimmunity, blood vessels, fibrosis. The C in scleroderma should remind you of the word collagen. Why? Because as you can see here, there is increased secretion, which actually of your profibrotic cytokines that leads to increased synthesis of extracellular matrix. That's why, as I have mentioned a while ago, among the three characteristic feature, the most prominent that you will see and that will also be responsible for the clinical manifestation of your patient would be fibrosis. It is said to be that CD4 T cells, okay, CD4 T cells are responding to an antigen accumulating in the skin, and it releases cytokines which activates the inflammatory cells and releases eventually the cytokines that stimulates the production of ECM, and as I have said, the eventual fibrosis expected in multiple organs of your patient. The vascular damage is consistently observed in the course of systemic sclerosis. It is regarded to be expected to be one of the initial lesions. The prominent finding is intimal proliferation, particularly in the digital arteries of patients with systemic sclerosis. So digits, so you check the nail folds, and the nail fold capillary loops are distorted. It is said to be that there is endothelial activation and injury, so that it ends up with intimal proliferation. So with endothelial activation and injury, intimal proliferation happens, so that the release of the mediators would eventually cause vascular smooth muscle narrowing. So as you can see here, we have a bit of a narrowing, and eventually this would lead to ischemic injury and obliterative vasculopathy. If it happens to be in your pulmonary vessels, then you are expecting pulmonary arterial hypertension as one of the manifestations. I have already emphasized fibrosis, and I have already informed you the role of cytokines to produce basically extracellular matrix. So, as I have said, this is evident in multiple organs, most notable, as I have emphasized in the previous slide, particularly in the skin of your patient. So the skin is the more often easily visible, recognizable abnormality. As you can see, if you're going to look at the section, there seems to be sclerotic atrophy of the skin. It is often beginning in the fingers and in the distal regions of the extremities. Why? If you're going to go back in the previous slide, as I have said a while ago, the intimal proliferation is often first manifested in the digits. So as you can see here, the site of involvement is particularly prominent in the digits of this patient, particularly the distal regions of the upper extremities. It is expected to have collagen deposition of or collagen fibers. So if you're going to look at the slides, as you can see, there is abundance of collagen fibers appearing as eosinophilic staining strands. There may also be, of course, infiltrates. Characteristically, these are CD4 T cells. And of course, you may see somewhat evidence of edema. So the skin, again, as I have said, is one of the easily recognizable manifestation. But I have also mentioned that it will also affect the muscle. So you will have muscle pain, joint pains. If it happens to be in the synovium, you're expecting hypertrophy and hyperplasia. In the GIT, it is actually appreciated in around 90% of cases, and it is in the particularly affecting the muscularis layer of the esophagus. So that being said, if it's the muscular layer of the esophagus, what would you then expect? You would expect your patient to have difficulty of swallowing, rubber hose-like inflexibility of your esophagus, and eventually it may lead to eventual problems like strictures, mucosa may be thinned out and ulcerated. So that's the effect for the GIT. For the kidneys, as I have mentioned a while ago, the blood vessels, particularly the intima, you'll have endothelial injury so that it leads to manifestation pertaining to hypertension. The arterioles particularly are affected. So in patients in which the predominant manifestation is on the kidney, you are to expect hypertension as one of the clinical manifestation. Why? Again, because of the intimal damage, there is concentric proliferation of your intimal cells. Now, for the lungs, it is usually presenting as fibrosis, just like in the kidney, in the skin. Sorry for the long spelling of fibrosis. The blood vessels, as I have mentioned in the previous slide, may eventually lead to pulmonary hypertension. Heart, you'll have pericarditis, myocardial fibrosis, and of course, thickening also of the arterioles. So do not forget, classic would be, it is systemic, but the skin will still be your predominant organ of involvement. So, it is commonly affecting females. I have already emphasized the importance of checking the skin. I have already mentioned to you why your patient is expected to have difficulty of swallowing, heart failure, arrhythmias, and of course, the digits of the hands are expected to be the ones with areas of necrosis. So how do we diagnose the disease? Again, we're talking of autoimmune, so you have to detect the presence of autoantibodies. So the two autoantibodies that are assayed specifically are as follows. One, you have your SCL70. This is regarded to be highly specific. It is present in around 10 to 20% of patients with diffuse systemic sclerosis. And the other one would be your anti-centromere antibody. This is found in 20 to 30 percent of patients with CREST. Again, what's CREST? Calcinosis, Raynaud's phenomenon, esophageal dysmotility, sclerodactyly, and telangiectasia. So do not forget, these are the two types of antibodies that are commonly associated with scleroderma. So some points to emphasize. Again, the C there should remind you of collagen, should remind you of fibrosis. The C there can also be used to remind you of chronic inflammation, which is, as I have mentioned, generally seen in autoimmune problems. The big S should remind you of the skin is one of the most common manifestation that is easily recognizable regardless of the type, be it limited or be it the diffuse type of scleroderma. Okay. So CREST, I have already mentioned this. Again, calcinosis, Raynaud's phenomenon, esophageal dysmotility, sclerodactyly, and telangiectasia. So we are going to, there are certain other autoimmune diseases mentioned in your book. The rheumatoid arthritis, I have mentioned that a while ago, particularly when we're talking of Sjogren's. I hope you still remember. For inflammatory myopathies, they are basically uncommon. For mixed connective tissue disease, we're talking here of an overlap, usually with SLE, scleroderma, and polymyositis. You have vascular problems, and often it is polyarteritis nodosa, which is necrotizing inflammation of the blood vessels. You have IgG4 related disease, which is basically tissue infiltrates dominated by IgG. Again, you'll have the same features: lymphoplasmacytic infiltrates, fibrosis, obliteration of blood vessels, which may lead to phlebitis. And of course, as the term implies, you're expecting to have increased IgG4. Okay. So let us go now to the next part of the topic, which is tissue transplants. Transplant rejection is important because of its basis in relation to our topic. It is immunologic reaction. It is basically immune mediated. And the major barrier to transplantation is the process of rejection. By rejection, it means the recipient's immune system is recognizing the graft as foreign and supposedly producing antibodies or T-cell reaction that will react against the graft and eventually will lead to the destruction of the graft. So, rejection is a process in which the T lymphocytes and the antibodies, as I have said, will be produced against the graft antigen. So say, for example, kidney transplanted to the patient and will destroy this renal transplant. If the graft exchange is between individuals of the same species, this is what we call as allograft. And graft from one species to another is what we call as xenograft. Usually what we do is allograft. So again, allograft, same species. So meaning your kidney going into another person who is having end-stage renal disease. However, when your kidney goes to that person, that patient will try to reject your kidney. And how does it happen? The first mechanism is recognition of graft antigen by T and B lymphocytes. There is antigenic differences between the donor and the recipient, which will result to rejection of the graft transplant in HLA alleles. HLA are polymorphic. There are always differences between individuals, even among twins. After you do the transplant, the recipient T cells would recognize the donor HLA antigen from the graft. Again, the recipient T cell will recognize the donor HLA antigen from the graft by two pathways. It can either be via the graft antigens are either presented directly to recipient T cells by antigen presenting cells, or the graft antigens are picked up by host antigen presenting cells, and it is processed like any other foreign antigen, and it is presented to host T cells. So ulit it can be recognized by two pathways, either direct or indirect activation. Now, both pathways, either direct or indirect, can lead to activation of CD8 T cells. CD8 T cells, okay, it can lead to activation of your CD8 T cells, which develop into cytotoxic T lymphocytes and CD4 positive T cells, which become cytokine-producing effector T cells, mainly T helper 1 cells. The direct pathway may be most important for cytotoxic T cell mediated acute rejection, and the indirect pathway may play a greater role in patients with chronic rejection. Now, when we say direct allo recognition, so with direct allo recognition, the T cells of the transplant recipient recognize allogenic donor MHC molecules on the surface of APCs in the graft. The T cells of the host will encounter the donor dendritic cells either within the grafted organ or after the dendritic cells migrate to the lymph nodes. As I have mentioned, the CD8 T cells are then activated to recognize your MHC molecules. The CD4 cytotoxic T cells are produced, and eventually it will act against your graft. For indirect recognition, the graft antigens are again picked up. They are processed and displayed by host antigen presenting cells. But then again, as I have said, it leads to the same pathway like that of your direct. It will lead to activation of your CD8 T cells, which will develop into your cytotoxic T lymphocytes and CD4 positive T cells. So the peptides derived from the donor tissue are presented by the host's own MHC, and the principal mechanism is via production of cytokines. So this is again a more graphical representation of what I am trying to explain. Now, the mechanism of allograft rejection can then be T-cell mediated, which is divided into two. You have acute and you have chronic, and it can also be B-cell mediated. So let us try to differentiate first acute cellular rejection, T-cell mediated versus chronic rejection. Acute cellular T-cell mediated rejection may produce different patterns of injury. So it is often happening or most commonly seen within the initial months after transplantation. It is, there is expected, as I have said, containing activated CD4 and CD8 T lymphocytes. The inflammation is expected to produce vascular pattern, and so you have to check the blood vessel wall in which lymphocytes and macrophages are supposed to be having perivascular inflammatory responses. For chronic rejection, the lymphocytes reacting against alloantigen in the vessel wall would secrete cytokines that will induce again local inflammation and stimulation of vascular endothelial and smooth muscle cell. So look at the last line. Chronic rejection, therefore, is dominated by vascular changes. You are expecting intimal thickening and vascular occlusion. So chronically rejecting kidney grafts would reveal glomerulopathy, duplication of basement membrane, and of course, chronic endothelial injury. Interstitial fibrosis, tubular atrophy is also expected. Now, so that's the T cell group. Let us go now to the other group, which is your antibody-mediated rejection or reaction. In here, it is classified into hyperacute, acute, and chronic on the basis of clinical and pathologic features. When you say hyperacute from the term itself, this is preformed. That's why it is happening in few split seconds. That's why the term is hyperacute. The preformed antibodies may be natural IgM specific for blood group antigen, or may be antibodies specific for allogenic major histocompatibility molecules that were induced because of prior exposure of the organ recipient to these cells. How? Like, for example, blood transfusion, pregnancy, or transplantation of another organ. So that basically you already have preformed anti-donor antibodies. So when you put the graft, the immune system of the patient can immediately recognize this because there was a previous encounter, and preformed antibodies are already formed against this antigen, so that the rejection may happen very quickly in a matter of seconds to a few minutes. Now, however, theoretically speaking, this can be avoided because before you do the transplant, you are supposed to match the donor with that of the recipient, both the blood type and the possible HLA types of your patient. So, the other one is what you call as acute rejection. It is mediated primarily by T cells and antibodies that are activated by alloantigens in the graft. So by timeline, this may occur within weeks or days after transplantation. And It is, again, occurring days or weeks after transplantation. If, however, there are cases in which it, it may appear much later if immunosuppression is tapered or terminated. So in acute cellular rejection, CD8 cytotoxic T cells may directly destroy the graft cells, or CD4 positive T cells will secrete cytokines and induce inflammation, which may damage the graft. The T cells may also affect your graft vessels, leading to vascular damage. So the last entity would be your chronic rejection. As I have said, this may take about months or years, which leads to progressive loss of graft function. So chronic rejection, since this is taking time, you're expecting interstitial fibrosis, of course, narrowing of graft vessels because of arteriosclerosis are also expected. So the problem here is that you have T cells that reacts against graft antigens, alloantigens, and secrete cytokines that stimulates the proliferation of your fibroblasts. That's why, as I have mentioned, you're expecting fibrosis and narrowing of graft vessels because of its effect on the vascular smooth muscle cells in the graft. So again, just to reemphasize, hyperacute is supposed to be preformed. You are supposed to have previous encounter with this type of antigens, like for example, in patients, as I have mentioned, with prior blood transfusion, so that when you put the graft, immediately your immune system recognizes it as foreign, and you have preformed antibodies that are ready to attack the graft. Again, this is a reiteration of acute. Again, as I have mentioned, it may happen in a matter of days or weeks. So you produce anti-donor antibodies, particularly HLA mediated, and eventually you'll end up with T cell and B cell mediated cytotoxicity. As I have said, chronic takes maybe years to develop. Eventually, you'll end up with fibrosis and vascular lesions as the most prominent findings. Okay, so let us try to take a look at some patients' images. So I chose to show you a renal transplantation surgery. So this is an example of a patient with transplantation, ongoing transplantation. And this is an example of a rejected graft right after transplant. And as you can see here, you see hemorrhagic cut surface. You will see obliteration of the blood vessel, as I have emphasized a while ago. So the rejection may take in the form of destruction of graft cells by T cells, okay? So that if you are going to look at the level of the tubules, which is in this image is letter A, the acute cellular rejection here of a kidney graft is manifested by inflammatory cells, which are seen in the interstitium and between epithelial cells of the tubules. These are your tubules, hence the term tubulitis. The tubules are collapsed and they are expected to have wavy basement membrane, which in this case is highlighted. So I suppose this is something using a special stain, like for example, periodic acid shift. Rejection vasculitis is evident on image B. As you can see, the vessels are occluded. The vessel is occluded and there is fibrosis and inflammatory cells. And the endothelial cells do have inflammatory cells. And this is what we term as endothelitis. This is an example of reaction vasculitis indicative of rejection. When you say hyperacute rejection, as I have said, it is something that happens in split seconds. It will, like in this image, these are examples of fibrin or seemingly eosinophilic material within the glomerular capillary tuft, showing you fibrin thrombi and severe ischemic injury in your glomerulus. So these are examples of images this time. On the left-hand side is showing you graft damage by antibody deposition in the vessels. And again, the arrowheads are pointing to the inflammatory infiltrates that are seen in between the tubules. The image on the right side is showing you capillaritis in the peritubular capillaries. It's basically C4D marker that is used. The deposition in peritubular capillaries are basically highlighted by the presence of your brown staining reaction, C4D deposits. So if you have this kind of images, so like we have here transplant glomerulopathy, in which the characteristic manifestation of chronic antibody-mediated rejection in the kidney is classically illustrated because the glomerulus will show inflammatory cells within the capillary loops, and this is what we term as glomerulitis. The mesangial matrix is expected to be accumulating. You have duplication of the basement membrane as well. On the right-hand side, these are examples of the asterisks are showing you examples of interstitial fibrosis, highlighted with blue trichrome stain is employed, showing you the fibrosis, contrasting it with the normal kidney on the top right. There is also an artery showing prominent arteriosclerosis in the bottom right, so this one. And basically that is eventually leading to narrowing of the vessel. Vessel occlusion is, again, as I have said and explained a while ago, a sign of rejection. So, well, this is something that I did so to again give you a better differentiation, hopefully helping you study comparing the different types of rejection as to hyperacute, acute, and chronic versus the paragraph form, of course, which is in your book. So, how can we increase the survival of the graft? Okay, so how can we increase the survival of the graft? As I have said a while ago, it is a must that before you do the transplant, you have to do HLA matching of the donor and that of the recipient. So that's one thing that is routinely done. Number two, you can do or give immunosuppressive drugs because, again, it is but natural for your immune cells to consider the graft as foreign. If you will recall the chapter on inflammation, it is the response of your tissues to injury. So putting a graft, it is but natural for your immune system to recognize it as non-self. So the tendency is for your immune cells to act against it. So that is when immunosuppressive drugs comes in. So these drugs are given supposedly to limit the inflammatory response that will be initiated by your body upon receiving the graft. Another thing here is in your book, it is also added as an addition would be plasmapheresis. It is used in case of severe antibody mediated reaction or rejection. So as I have mentioned there, you have here plasmapheresis. You can do T and B cell depleting antibodies. You can give pooled intravenous immunoglobulin. The recent strategy is reducing antigraft immune response by preventing host cells from receiving co-stimulatory signals from dendritic cells, which is accomplished by interrupting the interaction between the B7 molecules on the dendritic cells of the graft donor. That's actually the idea behind here, which is proteins that bind B7 co-stimulators. So these are some of the means in which hopefully the graft will survive and will lead to the treatment success of your patient. So we go now to transplantation of other solid organs, but I used kidney because like it is also the one used by Robbins. That's one of the most commonly transplanted organs with a great deal of success recorded already. So let's go now to hematopoietic stem cells. When you say hematopoietic stem cells, so you are using this treatment as particularly directed for patients with hematologic malignancies, those with bone marrow failure, like for example, aplastic anemia, or inherited bone marrow disorder, like for example, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, or immunodeficiency state. So you are trying to put in hematopoietic stem cells, which are obtained from the bone marrow or harvested from the peripheral blood. These are examples of sources, or it can also be cord blood of newborns. So that being said, these are examples that I have chose to get from other sites just to illustrate to you how it is happening. So the transplantation of hematopoietic cells can be obtained by a process called as harvesting. So like for example, in the image here, you are trying to harvest the stem cells from the peripheral blood employing a machine called apheresis. When you say autologous, you are using your own cells, okay? You're using your own cells. They are preserved and eventually you are, let's say you develop cancer and then they are supposed to give you chemo and radiotherapy to destroy the cancer cells. And then you are supposed to be reinfused with your own cells. And hopefully this would then grow new cells that are cancer-free. So the cells are coming from you. That's why it's called autologous. When you say allogenic, you are getting it from someone else. And that is when that is collected from the donor. It is also processed and preserved. Again, the cancer cells are supposed to be taken care of by giving chemo or radiotherapy. And then the new cells are infused and hopefully the hematopoietic stem cells will survive. This is how it is given and will lead to your treatment. So as I have said, hematopoietic stem cells are used to treat hematologic malignancies, bone marrow failure syndromes, like for example, aplastic anemia, inherited bone marrow disorders like sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, and immunodeficiency states. Or it can also be coming from cord blood. Okay, it can also be coming from cord blood. As you can see here, I took this from another source. This is an example of hematopoietic stem cell cord blood. So when the baby is born, you harvest the cord blood, you preserve the cord blood, put it in a blood bank or a cord blood bank, and then should the time is as it is preserved, okay, they are basically preserved and they are kept preserved, frozen. This is one way on how they are preserved, and you can again do either auto or allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. This is an example of this time using an embryo, which we do not want. Why? Because of course you're getting tissues from the embryo, and it is somewhat with moral issues. So I hope you are able to get what I am trying to explain. Hematopoietic stem cells are supposedly intended for those with hematologic malignancies, bone marrow failure, and inherited defects. It is supposed to be that you destroy first the cancer cells and then you transplant the sources I have already enumerated. It is well explained in the last 2 or 3 slides. Okay. Now, what is your problem with transplantation? Well, graft versus host disease is happening when immunologically competent cells or their precursors are transplanted into immunologically compromised recipients. And the cells will recognize the alloantigen in the host and attack the host tissues. So take note. Here, what is competent is the graft, the kidney that we are trying to give. And the immunologically crippled here is the patient who is trying to receive the kidney transplant, or shall we say the hematopoietic stem cells. So, when immunocompromised recipients receive the hematopoietic stem cells from allogenic donors, the immunocompetent T cells present in the donor recognize the recipient's HLA antigen as foreign. And since the donor is the one that is immunologically competent, they will react against that of the host. Okay, so they will react against it, so that it will lead to rejection. To minimize graft versus host disease, hematopoietic stem cell transplant are done between donor and recipient who are, as I have said, HLA matched, and you have to have precise DNA sequencing-based methods for typing of their alleles. Now, so it may be acute, it may be chronic. If it's acute, it happens within days or weeks after the transplant. Any organ may be affected. When we're talking of hematopoietic stem cells, any organ may be affected, but often you can see it in the skin, liver, and intestine. It is manifesting as a generalized rash that may lead to desquamation of the skin. The bile ducts may be destroyed and it may give rise to jaundice. The GIT, it may present as diarrhea, often bloody. So these are your clues that your patient is having acute graft versus host disease. In chronic graft versus host disease, it may follow an acute syndrome or it may occur insidiously. These patients may have extensive cutaneous injury, skin just like in acute appendages and fibrosis of the dermis, seemingly like that of scleroderma, may be seen in your patient. In the GI, you may appreciate the presence of strictures because of fibrosis. The patient may develop manifestations of autoimmunity. This is postulated to be coming from the result of grafted CD4 helper T cells reacting with your host B cells and stimulating these cells to produce autoantibodies. So, graft versus host disease is one problem. Secondly is immunodeficiency. The immunodeficiency may be resulting from a prior treatment, because if you will recall the images I have shown you a while ago, you give chemo or radiation therapy before you give the hematopoietic stem cells. So these will cause a depletion also on the bone marrow cells, like for example, your natural white blood cells, which is supposed to protect the individual against infection. And the radiation may have a delay in the repopulation of the recipient's immune system. And so it then happens that it can, the attack on the host immune cells by the grafted lymphocytes can lead further to immunodeficiency. The affected individuals are profoundly immunosuppressed, and of course, with this, infection easily sets in. Many organisms are implicated. Cytomegalovirus is one of the most fatal complications that are recorded among patients having such problems after transplantation. Okay? So I hope you understand those topics that I was trying to discuss on rejection. Okay. Now, the next part would be immunodeficiency syndrome. And I think it is good to have a 5-minute break. So I will stop the share, and after 5 minutes, we will resume. And this time, we will give you the rest of the topic, and that is immunodeficiency.